So we know how beneficial the squat movement is for the body, but did you know that we can actually use a squat to diagnose the level of muscle tightness we have in the body? Check this out. So if I go into a squat side on, as I come down to the ground, the perfect squat is hips are as low as possible, so my heels are touching my hamstrings, my back is straight, my bottom is sticking out, and my knees are over the toes. Now from front on, the knees are pulled a little wider than where the feet are. So using that textbook squat as a diagnosis tool, we can now compare that with someone who has tightness across the body. So if I go back into a squat, the Western squat looks something like this. So I bend the knees, and as I get to around that 90-degree mark of the knee flexion, that's when the back will start to round, the bottom starts to tuck under, and usually for most people, they end up around here. Some people can go a little lower, and you'll notice as they continue to go down towards the ground with the bottom, the back starts to round even more. So it looks something like this. Now there are a couple of reasons why the back starts to round. So as I face you in a squat position, the first thing you want to test out is how much you can keep the feet facing forward and keep the knees out to the side. You'll notice that if you're tight in the ankles, the feet will start to buckle inwards. So the arch starts to collapse and we start to pronate the feet. A lot of people that generally have pronated feet will end up going a little wider with their squat, or you'll notice that they'll turn the feet out to compensate. And even then, you can see that my arches are collapsing and the feet are pronating inwards. So to stop the ankles from pronating, we want to perform exercises that allow us to roll the ankle out or supinate the ankle. For this, you want to do the one that I have taught in a previous video, where you roll the ankle out towards the ground whilst holding onto a stick or the side of a wall. The second thing is the distance between the knees. So someone who is relatively comfortable in the squat, you'll notice they'll have a lot more hip abduction. So as they go down into the squat, the more the knees will start to pull apart. Now, there's two reasons why that happens. The first one is when you shift the weight from the knees to the hips, as you go into more abduction, that's when you can access the hips a lot better. Whereas someone who's quite tight in their hip abduction will end up sitting in a squat like this, where the knees are pretty much in line with the feet or over the feet, or they're a bit more narrow, which also contributes towards rounding of the back. So the more knee abduction we have, the more we can go into the hips and the more we can sit back more upright. For hip abduction, the best exercise you can do is a sumo squat, where you place the hands on top of the thighs or the knees, and then you focus on pulling the knees apart. This leads us perfectly onto the calf muscle. So we talked about pronation of the ankles and how that is affected by the calves. The other thing that you'll notice, which is quite obvious, is how far you can get your knees over your toes. If the calves are tight, generally speaking, most people will have their knees either in line with their toes or just slightly forward. This is evident in people that can't squat below 90 degrees. Their knees will be a lot further back to counterbalance their squat movement. So the best calf exercise I suggest you do is the one where you wedge yourself between the door frame, or you can do the one on the box where you drop the back heel down. Next are the quads. So as I go back into the squat, if my quads are tight, this will stop me from getting my bottom down towards a heel. Tight quads are the biggest contributing factor to knee issues. You'll notice this if you sit on the ground on your heels. The more distance you've got between your heels and your bottom, the tighter the quads are, and you'll notice the more pressure it'll put in the knees. So we want to learn to stretch the quads out to allow the bottom to come down onto the heels, which will take the pressure off the knees. To stretch the quads out, we can just do a simple couch quad stretch against the wall to help us loosen off the quads. All right, so the last one is the hips. Now for this, there are a couple of things we want to focus on. As I said at the start of the video, when the back starts to round when you're going into a squat, this may not necessarily be the lower back. Now the muscle that's mainly responsible for the excessive rounding of the back is called the iliacus, which is actually a hip flexor muscle. Now when we talk about the hip flexors, most people tend to focus on the psoas and never really look at the other ones. The iliacus is the main muscle that allows us to tip the hip forward and back, so anterior and posterior pelvic tilting. It's this muscle that usually causes people a lot of issues when they are going into the squat. So the best exercise I would recommend you do to lengthen and strengthen this muscle is a seated good morning off a plyometric box. All right, so try these tests out and then use the correct exercise to loosen that muscle, and then retest out your squat.